In a big story, there's always a lot of different characters. And different characters will have different takes on the story, different perspectives, different windows, different insight. This morning we have with us one of the temple guards, security detail. What's their take? What did they see? What's their impression, their perspective? I wonder.
Security's a pretty boring job. I know we have this air of excitement, technology, gadgets, danger, running and catching bad guys, cool outfits and weapons. Really, it's a lot of standing around. Making sure people don't wander where they shouldn't, giving directions and being stared at by tourists. Most of our job is actually keeping the Gentiles in their court, making sure people behave in an orderly fashion, watching the temple market and making sure nobody enters the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies is where the Ark of the Covenant was kept in King Solomon's time. It's where the high priest goes to meet with God. And even then, he's only allowed in once a year on the Day of Atonement to offer offerings for us, the people. Our other duty is to the high priest and the members of the Sanhedrin. I don't have to tell you, these are dangerous times. The poor are incredibly poor. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, is incredibly repressive for us Jews. And King Herod is a greedy, dirty so-and-so. You see, King Herod, who was put there by the Romans, thinks that the Sanhedrin have too much power. And there are always political and religious fanatics who think that they're not doing their job properly. But mostly, it's pretty ho-hum. Often the only relief from the monotony of the day is listening to the rabbis on the porch teaching. Occasionally they have some really interesting and entertaining exchanges, particularly when their interjectors, well, they're usually just some overexcited people with a personal axe to grind. There was one who stood out over the last week, however. In fact, I've barely been able to get him off my mind since. It seems he's grown quite popular out in the provinces. And last Sunday when he entered, with all of the other pilgrims who come to celebrate the Passover, they made a fuss of him, waving branches, throwing their coats, and hailing him as some kind of king. And when you work security, you learn how to identify anyone as a troublemaker, things that might stand out. But this guy, he came into the temple. I wasn't in the outer courtyard, I was in the main, but I heard the commotion and called as reinforcements. I ran in. The scene was almost over when I arrived, but what was left? Tables flipped and capsized, coins scattered, the animals running, screeching, braying, people shouting, clinking. Jesus of Galilee, forgive me. Jesus of Galilee had left the temple. But the echo of his words overwhelmed all the noise, burned into the memory of all who heard them. My Father's house is for worshippers, not thieves. Don't tell anyone I said this, but he was right. I think everyone else knew it too, because nobody tried to stop him. Later on in that day, though, I did see some angry huddles of the Sanhedrin and the leaders. Overheard some words which formed a pit in my stomach. It's a feeling I've had many times before. I knew it well. It's the feeling I have when something bad is about to happen. And normally it means I wake up with a few more bruises than I went to bed with. All through the week, the leaders were looking for a way to catch Jesus out, to trip him up, make him say something blasphemous or treasonous, or they confronted him, asked him directly about his authority, which he answered well. Actually made them look a bit silly at the same time. Then they tried to get him in trouble with the Romans. Asked him about paying taxes, which is a very sore subject for a lot of people. They'd rather pay with their spit than their coin. But again, he answered, well. Then the Sadducees, who don't believe in life after death, they asked him their favourite trick question. I've heard it and I've seen it stump many. Something about 7 brothers, but the way he answered both stumped them and pleased the other leaders. Finally, one of the lawyers stepped up and said, "What is the main decree of the law?" I'll never forget his answer as long as I live. So simply he said, love. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind and soul. And then, love your neighbour as yourself. So simple. We all nodded and agreed. It was incredible. It was frightening, actually, to see the power of this man, the sway he had over the people in his presence. Instead of the leaders discrediting him in public, the people agreed with him. I'm not at all surprised, actually, that people were questioning whether he was the Messiah, the promised king who would restore our nation and faith with truth and power, because I was. The leaders wouldn't bother him with any more questions. It wasn't going to work for them. So they left him alone for a while. And yet this pit in my stomach, it grew and it worsened. I wanted to tell him to be careful. Watch what you're saying. He openly criticized the leaders for their lack of care of the poor, for lack of love and social justice. He predicted that our temple would fall. The more he spoke, the more the leaders grew frightened and frustrated that they couldn't control him. They're powerful people. And powerful people are dangerous when they're angry. And they're worse when they're frightened. It was about midnight. The quiet of the barracks was broken by our captain saying, "Out of bed! On parade in 5!" All we were told was we were going to arrest a criminal, expect some trouble. And that knot in my stomach tightened. This many men meant a lot of trouble. We marched to Caiaphas' house, and there we were joined by a few of his servants and some junior members of the Sanhedrin. Under cover of dark, we crept out of town, off the road, into the bush. Extra quiet now, came the message down the line. Further and further we crept, until suddenly we came upon some men in the bush. Some had obviously been sleeping as they awoke. And there in the middle, I saw him. Jesus. But not as he was. He was calm, but not peaceful. He looked tired. He looked weaker somehow, older. Or maybe it was my imagination or a trick of the light, because when I look back at him, he was himself. As we surrounded them, a man from our column stepped towards him and kissed him. Immediately we made to arrest him. Suddenly a hiss, a flash, a scream, and some warm spots of blood hit my face. One of the men with Jesus had drawn his sword and attacked Caiaphas' servant. Normally, he would be dead before he took another step. But Jesus looked at him and said something I didn't hear, and the sword was dropped. Then he turned to us and looked at us, asking for a moment of freedom, which I don't know why, but we gave him. Then he knelt down in front of the injured man and touched his ear. Immediately it was healed. Like it wasn't seconds before, laying on the ground beside him? Then he stood up and walked the way back to Jerusalem in front of us. None of us dared touch him. When we returned to Jerusalem, we were dismissed. I tried to go to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I was just so confused by that arrest. It didn't make any sense. I couldn't understand his calm. I was frightened for his life. Why? This man that I barely knew, I was just doing my job. I'd done this 1,000 times. Why should I care? I didn't understand it. And this pit in my stomach just wouldn't go away. Why? We'd made the arrest. There was no trouble coming. Morning came. I must have got some sleep because I awoke. I tried to shake off the feeling and I returned my post in the main temple courtyard. I couldn't understand what had happened the night before, and still in my thoughts, I didn't hear any more about Jesus since that night. I assumed he got what all the other criminals we arrest got, probably a beating, a threatening. He was probably turned out of town, never to return. The thought of that made me sad. I'd never seen anything like it. I couldn't understand the effect this man had had on me. His power, his honesty, his wisdom, his kindness, the look in his eyes, the warmth of him. He was so penetrating. It was unforgettable. The temple was eerily quiet that day, though there was drama outside. There was drama outside all day, and I didn't really notice as I was in my thoughts about Jesus until noon. Snapping me out of my reverie, everything went black. And I mean, it was dark. It was darker than a moonless night. And there are always some lanterns burning in the temple, but it's weird when you have to light every single one at noon. What happened next? I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen it. I don't expect you to believe me, but it happened. The curtain in front of the Holy of Holies was torn in two from top to bottom. And no one did it. I mean, no one touched. I was on high alert. If anyone had moved in that place, I'd have arrested them, but it just happened on its own. The fear I felt as I realized I was staring into the Holy of Holies brought me to my knees. I thought for a second, run, hide, cover your eyes, but as I looked, I was filled with a feeling I couldn't fathom. I wasn't frightened. The knot in my stomach released. There was no more trouble coming. There was no fear. I felt myself smiling. I thought I would laugh, but to feel tears on my face. I thought for sure, and I know now that I was in the presence of God. As I watched, a light filled the temple into every dark corner, sanctifying the space with the love that I felt. And I heard the words of Jesus. Love. Love your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. I knew then my world would never be the same. The whole world would never be the same. It couldn't be. From that day I knew I had to follow Jesus into his way with God. That's the truth. I hope you'll believe me.